hang on to the land. You fight her, she'll bleed you dry, he warned. But, you ain't alone, son. And just like that, the tide began to turn. Because you can only step on a man's grief so many times before he rises with fire in his eyes. So tell me, has your HOA ever crossed the line? Has anyone ever tried to rip away something sacred, just because they could? Leave a comment. Say sunflower, if you've ever had to fight back against the kind of evil that wears pearls and calls itself polite. Because this isn't over. This is just the beginning. Within just 6 months, I had lost nearly everything my family had spent over 50 years building. What little sense of peace I'd hoped to create on this land, this memorial garden for my wife, had been trampled, not by accident, but through calculated cruelty. And when I listened to Diesel Murphy's story, it struck me like a punch to the gut. His tale wasn't just a cautionary example, it was a blueprint. A horror story of what awaited me if I didn't act. Diesel's words still echo in my mind. She doesn't just take your land, he told me, knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his steering wheel. She breaks you first. Makes you watch everything you love die. By the time I lost the ranch, I was actually grateful, man. Grateful just to make the pain stop. That hit me harder than I expected. Diesel's family ranch had been in his family for 3 generations, 80 acres of cattle pasture and cornfields. His grandfather built that place with his own hands, raised children and livestock under the same sun I now worked under. But Diane Harper had found a way to dismantle all of it, piece by piece, using her favorite weapons. Forged inspections, fake rules, and legal fees designed to bleed a man dry. Diesel's water permits were suddenly revoked for technical violations that inspectors couldn't, or wouldn't, identify. The well water his family had used for decades was randomly declared contaminated by county health officials who never provided testing results. And when he dared to fight back, the legal costs buried him. The fines added up faster than he could pay them. Eventually, he had no choice but to mortgage the ranch. That was when Diane made her move. She'd offered to buy the land through an LLC she wasn't involved with, and Diesel had accepted, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't breathe anymore under the weight of grief, debt, and humiliation. Now he lived in a 1-bedroom apartment above a tire shop in town, working 6 days a week as a mechanic just to survive, while the land that carried his family's name sat abandoned, overgrown, and lost to history. And he wasn't the only one. Old Peterson, another widower like me, had planted a small vegetable garden in memory of his late wife. Tomatoes, cucumbers, and strawberries she'd loved to grow. Diane had the garden declared a soil health risk and had it bulldozed under HOA supervision. A young family down the road with 3 little kids tried to install rain barrels. They were fined for unauthorized water collection until they were driven back into apartment living. A veteran suffering from PTSD had started a therapy garden, his only escape, and watched it get destroyed over and over again until he had a full-blown breakdown that put him in the hospital. Each of their stories followed the same script. Diane found out what meant the most to you, then used HOA bureaucracy to crush it. Slowly. Legally. Mercilessly. She finds what makes you happy, Diesel said. Then she kills it slowly, piece by piece, until you can't stand living here anymore. Then she buys your property for pennies on the dollar. I wanted to think it wouldn't happen to me. That maybe my wife's sunflower memorial would be safe because it wasn't hurting anyone. But I knew better. The next morning, my nightmare began. There was a piece of paper taped to my front door. Notice of contamination, immediate suspension of water use. It was stamped with the emblem of a county water agency and signed by a man claiming to be an official inspector. The notice claimed that tests on my well had revealed bacterial contamination posing a significant health risk to the community. All water used from my property was to cease immediately pending further laboratory confirmation. The final line was underlined twice: any usage of well water for any purpose will result in criminal charges. I walked straight to the kitchen sink and turned the faucet. Nothing. Not even a sputter. They'd shut off my water entirely. Within days, the remaining sunflower seedlings, my wife's legacy, would wither and die in the July heat. I stood there in that silence, staring at the dry faucet, feeling like someone had just cut the last string holding me together. I called the county office. The inspector named on the notice didn't exist. I called the state water board. No record of any testing on my property. It was all a lie, another manufactured crisis designed to finish me off. But I wasn't Diesel. Not yet. I wasn't going to give up. Because while Diane Harper was ruthless, she'd made one mistake. She forgot what I used to do for a living. I'd spent 15 years working for a municipal water department in California. I knew everything about water systems, how they were pressurized, how they were routed, how to read meters, valves, and flow maps. While she was busy playing HOA Queen, I started using my old skills. That evening, I took my tools and started quietly inspecting the property line. What I found made my jaw clench and my stomach twist. Diane's massive cattle operation wasn't just using her own water supply. It was leeching off the entire communities. Her ranch was hooked directly into the main water line through a patchwork of unauthorized taps and hidden underground pipes. She wasn't rationing water, she was stealing it. Every family in Dusty Creek was paying for municipal service, but a third of that water was being siphoned directly into Diane's private tanks. At night, her pumps came on, pulling thousands of gallons into her underground cisterns, which fed her livestock and irrigation systems during the day. Meanwhile, the rest of us were left with rising bills, mysterious outages, and drought warnings. It was the oldest scam in the book. Create the crisis. Profit from the cure. Over the next 3 days, I mapped out her system in detail. I used digital flow meters, handheld pressure gauges, and marked pressure loss along pipe junctions. Her entire setup was amateur at best, hastily assembled, unregulated, and easily traceable to her property. But it was effective. She'd been doing this for years, hidden behind a wall of fake inspections and HOA policy. 6 families had already fallen victim in the last 5 years. Families who'd sold their land at rock-bottom prices to Diane's shell companies after being regulated out of existence. But as I examined the system closer, something caught my eye, and for the first time since my wife died, I smiled. Diane's entire water theft operation had one major flaw. It was a one-way system. Her hidden pipes, her pumps, her valves, they were all designed to move water in one direction, from the community lines to her storage tanks. She'd rigged the system to prevent backflow, likely thinking it would protect her from detection. But that protection created a vulnerability. With a few minor modifications, nothing too complex, I could reverse the flow. If I redirected even a small portion of the pressure back into her lines, her entire setup would fail. Pumps would seize. Tanks would overflow. Valves would rupture. And if I timed it right, I could trigger it when county water usage was at its peak, setting off a cascade of pressure problems that would ripple through every tap connected to her theft ring. All without leaving a single fingerprint. But before I acted, I needed to understand the scope. So I kept digging. Over the next few nights, I followed every pipe, every junction, every odd spike in the pressure readings. What I uncovered wasn't just simple theft. It was systematic, organized fraud. Diane's ranch was consuming over 30,000 gallons per day, 10 times the average for a property of that size. The entire community water system was engineered for 25 homes, and yet nearly 40% of the capacity was being funneled into her ranch. She'd stolen over $500,000 in water over 5 years. Made over $100,000 annually in profits from cattle she watered with stolen resources. But her fraud went deeper. I matched water shortage complaints with property sales and HOA violations. In every case, the water crisis started right after someone challenged Diane. Refused to vote for her proposals. Complained about her animals. Simply didn't fit her vision of a curated, profitable Dusty Creek. The same pattern every time. Sudden contamination or shortage. HOA fines and citations. Legal threats. Financial collapse. Below-market sale to Diane's people. Mysterious resolution of water issues. Resale at full price. She controlled the rules, the referees, and the outcome. As HOA president, Diane could declare emergencies, enforce restrictions, and approve inspection results from her friends. The lawyers, inspectors, and title agents were all in her pocket. No one had ever challenged her system, because on paper, it was flawless. But the pipes never lie. And now I knew her system better than she did. Diane Harper thought she was playing chess while everyone else played checkers. But she forgot one thing. Some men don't fight for profit. Some fight for memory. I wasn't here for revenge. I was here for my wife. And I was going to bring her sunflowers back, with or without permission. Diane Harper thought she'd won. After years of manipulating the system, exploiting the trust of neighbors, and hiding behind official-sounding documents, she'd grown comfortable in her dominance. Comfortable enough to believe that nobody could touch her, much less beat her at her own game. But what she didn't know, what she couldn't begin to understand, was that she'd finally gone too far. In trying to destroy me completely, she had created the very monster that would end her reign. Her empire was built on theft, deceit, and bureaucracy. It was a cleverly designed machine engineered for one purpose: to bleed people dry while keeping her hands clean. On paper, everything looked legitimate. Emergency water shutoffs. Contamination notices. Utility fines. Legal complaints. Every move cloaked in the authority of official documentation, signed by people who either didn't exist or were too deep in her pocket to resist her will. But even the most well-oiled machine can be sabotaged from within, especially if you know how it works. I did. I'd spent over a decade in California's municipal water systems. I understood pumps, valves, pressure points, and the subtle art of water flow management better than most engineers. I knew how to spot inefficiencies, how to detect leaks invisible to the naked eye, and more importantly, how to reroute systems designed to function in one direction and make them run backwards. And that's exactly what Diane had built, a one-way theft system with no defense against reversal. Her water theft operation was efficient but arrogant. It relied on hidden piping networks, siphoning municipal water into private underground systems that fed her cattle operation and sustained her fraudulent empire. While families were told to conserve, while children's gardens wilted and elderly residents suffered, Diane's cows drank without limits. Her fields were always green. Her profits always growing. But her system had a flaw, one she hadn't noticed because her ego wouldn't let her imagine anyone could ever fight back. The flaw was simple. Her infrastructure was designed for only one direction of water flow. The illegal taps she'd installed at 3 key points on the community line weren't monitored properly. Her pumps depended on specific pressure differentials that she thought nobody would understand. Her storage tanks were positioned downhill to receive gravity-fed inputs, not to resist backflow. What that meant was, with a few strategic modifications, I could turn her entire water theft system into a self-sabotaging loop. Instead of siphoning water from the community, it would suck water out of her ranch. Instead of her pumps drawing from our shared supply, they would pump her own reserves back into the municipal line, serving the very people she'd spent years abusing. Her ranch would run dry, her cattle would thirst, and she would never see it coming. It was beautiful in its simplicity. Elegant, even. A form of justice that spoke in the language she used: plumbing, pressure, and paperwork. I didn't need an army or a courtroom. I just needed 3 valve replacements, a few industrial-grade reverse flow meters, and a control timer I could set to activate at midnight when her system pulled the hardest. Through my contacts in the water management world, I secured the parts quietly. No orders in my name. No paper trail. Just favors called in and questions answered with long silences and looks that said, "Whatever this is for, it's worth it." For 3 weeks, I worked silently and methodically. While she harassed others, I mapped her entire pipeline. Every unauthorized connection. Every weak point. I crawled through ditches, ran fiber scopes through access ports, used pressure gauges to trace her system like a circulatory map. I knew her layout better than she did. I even found the buried pump house she'd disguised as an equipment shed, covered in weeds and brambles to keep people away. I rewired the pressure controls, inverted the polarity of her submersible pumps, and rigged a bypass timer to reverse flow during the hours her usage was highest. Once the switch flipped, her system would begin draining itself automatically. Her storage tanks would empty. Her cattle troughs would go dry. Her sprinkler systems would sputter and die. Best of all, her sensors, calibrated only for input, not output, wouldn't register anything wrong. She'd see the same gallons per minute rate and assume the water was coming in, when it was actually rushing out. It would take her weeks to figure it out. And by then, the damage would be irreversible. But just when I thought I was ready to act, Diane did something that escalated everything. She didn't just continue her attacks, she took it to a level so cruel, so unthinkable, that it hardened my resolve beyond anything I believed possible. She went after my wife's memory. I knew she'd noticed the change in me. She wasn't stupid, just arrogant. She saw that I'd stopped reacting like a broken man. That I no longer begged or pleaded. That my eyes didn't carry the same weight of helplessness when she spoke. And predators like Diane don't back down when their prey gets dangerous, they double down. They lash out harder. She had a private investigator dig into my life. Not just my finances or legal records. She wanted pain. She wanted grief. She found it in the details of my wife's death. The hospital stays. The insurance denials. The hospice care. The second mortgage we took out for the treatment that didn't work. She discovered the sunflowers, how they were my wife's favorite flower, how I'd promised her I'd keep planting them every year. She learned everything sacred to me. Then she set out to destroy it. On the anniversary of my wife's death, I took my usual 3-hour trip to visit her grave. I brought sunflowers. I stayed longer than usual. It was a quiet day, heavy with memories. I had no idea that back home, my life was being erased. When I returned that evening, I didn't recognize my own property. My house, my sanctuary, was gone. Reduced to rubble. Shattered wood, scorched insulation, and twisted metal strewn across the yard like the aftermath of a bomb. It looked like a war zone. A war I hadn't realized I'd been drafted into. The official story was absurd, an emergency utility maintenance order citing a suspected gas leak near my foundation. The paperwork, of course, was signed by an inspector that didn't exist. The demolition crew left no contact info. No permits had been filed with the county. No warnings. Just destruction. But it wasn't the house that broke me. It was what they targeted. My wife's belongings were systematically destroyed. Her jewelry smashed. Her clothes shredded. Her photo albums, burned. Our wedding picture, missing. The bookshelf she built with her own hands, splintered into firewood. And then I saw the garden. The sunflowers, ripped out, scattered across the yard like trash. The memorial stones she decorated, crushed and kicked apart. The heart-shaped arrangement of bricks I'd laid around her favorite plant, smashed. The box I'd hidden beneath the soil, containing her letters, her journal, and our last photograph together, dug up and set on fire. Ashes. Everything I loved reduced to ashes. And pinned to the fence, with a single rusted nail, was a note. Handwritten. Mocking. Cruel. Gardens won't bring her back. Water serves the living. Signed in the unmistakable sharp, looping script of Diane Harper. That was the moment the last piece of my old self died. Grief had carried me for months, kept me tethered to memories. But that day, grief turned to ice. To rage. To something cold and calculating. Diane had done more than attack my home. She had desecrated my wife's memory. She had taken the one sacred thing I had left and used it as a weapon. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood there, staring at the smoking remains of the photo box, and felt my soul settle into a new shape. The shape of a man with nothing left to lose, and every reason to strike. Diesel found me an hour later. He said I was just sitting there, motionless, staring at the wreckage. He said my eyes scared him. "You ready to end this?" he asked, voice low, tight with fury. I nodded once. And that night, I flipped the switch. The valve system I'd built over weeks came to life with a soft, mechanical hum. Pumps reversed. Pressure shifted. Flow meters recalibrated themselves silently. And just like that, Diane Harper's theft empire began bleeding itself dry, 1 gallon at a time. Justice wasn't coming. It had already arrived. But by this point, it wasn't about water anymore. It wasn't about returning stolen gallons to a community that had suffered silently for years. It wasn't even about justice in the traditional sense. No, by now, it was about ensuring that Diane Harper's cattle ranch would rot under the sun. That it would become a parched, hollow ruin, a monument to unchecked greed and the cost of cruelty. I wanted her pastures to turn brown, her fountains to crust over, her livestock to suffer the thirst she had inflicted on others without a second thought. This wasn't about redemption. This was about retribution. Type justice if you think Diane deserves what's coming. Because Chapter 5 is where everything explodes. Exactly 3 weeks after she destroyed my house and desecrated my wife's memorial garden, 3 weeks after she turned my life into ash, Diane Harper threw herself a party. But this wasn't just any event. This was her victory parade. A carefully orchestrated public theater of dominance meant to hammer home a message to the entire community: cross me, and I will erase you. It was her final flourish, the closing act in a play where she played queen, executioner, and saint, all in one. The party was labeled as a community leadership celebration, ostensibly to honor Diane's years of selfless service as the HOA president of Dusty Creek. But no one was fooled. Everyone in the neighborhood understood what it really was: a public display of raw power. An intimidation ritual. A gloating session dressed in white linen and catered hors d'oeuvres. This was where Diane would bask in the fear of her neighbors, strut through the fruits of her corruption, and make sure no one ever forgot what happened when you dared to defy her. She mailed out gold-embossed invitations to every property owner in Dusty Creek, no detail overlooked. Attendance wasn't technically mandatory, but the language in the invites made it feel like missing the event would be a grave mistake. Phrases like community cohesion, mandatory unity, and shared prosperity depends on mutual participation were slipped in with all the subtlety of a loaded gun. And of course, the venue was her pride and joy, the Harper Ranch. It was a sprawling spread of stolen wealth. Green fields that defied Texas drought. Livestock that looked like they belonged on a showground. Endless rows of manicured landscaping, bubbling fountains, decorative koi ponds, and an irrigation system that ran 24/7, all of it sustained by water that didn't belong to her. Every drop had been siphoned from the rest of us. From elderly residents who had to bathe with buckets. From families whose gardens had dried up. From kids who couldn't play in the sprinklers because water restrictions had turned into rationing. But Diane didn't just flaunt her stolen resources, she weaponized them. She made sure everyone who set foot on her property that day saw what power looked like. She flew in a catering crew from Austin, complete with portable outdoor kitchens and full staff. A well-known country band was hired to play under a white tent strung with fairy lights. There were monogrammed napkins, signature cocktails, and valet parking on gravel roads. No expense was spared. And critically, Diane had cranked her water consumption into overdrive in the weeks leading up to the event. Her landscaping crew had been running the sprinklers for hours a day to keep every patch of grass emerald green. Her fountains had bubbled non-stop. Her livestock watering systems were calibrated to maximum flow to ensure her herd looked healthy and strong. All in preparation for a single afternoon where she could show the entire community what domination looked like. But what she didn't know, what she could never have suspected, was that every drop of water she had so confidently pumped across her property was feeding the system I had spent months infiltrating, modifying, and perfecting. The night before the party, I made my final adjustments under cover of darkness. Wearing dark clothes, armed with equipment borrowed from friends in the municipal water management world, I worked quietly beneath the moonlight. The system was already installed, it had been operating in the background, learning her patterns, measuring her usage, fine-tuning the flow rates. But now it was time to prime the final failsafe. And the beauty of it all, the elegance that still makes me smile, was that from her perspective, everything looked perfect. Her control panels reported normal readings. Her pressure gauges showed standard input-output balance. Her flow meters spun at expected RPMs. But deep underneath the shell of her stolen empire, her entire system had been inverted. I had reversed the flow of her pumps. Redirected the paths of her pipes. Designed subtle, untraceable changes that took her theft system, and turned it into a self-destruct mechanism. Every gallon she pulled was actually being pushed out. Her own water tanks were now feeding the municipal line. The more she tried to use, the more she lost. The system had been rigged to consume itself, quietly, methodically, like a parasite chewing through its own host. At 2 p.m. sharp, the party began. From my spot on the ridge overlooking her property, I watched the guests arrive. They parked in neat rows. Dusty Creek residents in their best jeans and boots, trying to smile, trying to act like they were there by choice. I saw them greet Diane with cautious handshakes, offering fake compliments and sideways glances. You could smell the fear in the air. These were the same people who had watched her destroy families, take homes, turn neighbors into enemies, and they'd done nothing. Their silence had been her permission. Their cowardice had been her fuel. But today, they would witness something different. At exactly 3:15 p.m., as the music played and laughter echoed across the pastures, I flipped the final switch. It started small, imperceptible to most. A quiet shift in the speed of one pump. A subtle drop in one pressure gauge. A fountain that gurgled just slightly before continuing to bubble. Diane didn't notice. Not yet. She was too busy making rounds, holding court, bragging about how much the property had appreciated under her leadership. But behind the scenes, the system had begun its slow, deliberate collapse. By 4 p.m., the first signs of trouble surfaced. Guests began commenting on how one of the decorative fountains seemed sluggish. The water wasn't spraying as high. The sound had changed, thinner, weaker. Diane dismissed it with a wave, claiming there must be some issue with the new pump her staff had installed. But she was annoyed. I could see it in the way she snapped at the nearest ranch hand, sending him to check the filtration system. At 4:30, things escalated. The sprinklers started sputtering. Not all at once, but in scattered patches. Some heads shot out streams, while others barely hissed. The lush lawn began to show dry spots. The catering team complained they had no water pressure in the outdoor kitchen, making cleanup nearly impossible. Guests were starting to murmur. Something wasn't right. By 5 p.m., Diane's kingdom began to collapse. The fountains dried up completely, leaving exposed rocks, dead koi, and algae scum. The smell was unbearable. The sprinkler system stopped entirely, leaving her picture-perfect lawn to bake under the brutal Texas sun. Her cattle, so carefully groomed, gathered anxiously around their empty troughs, mooing and pacing, already showing signs of dehydration. The landscaping she'd paid thousands to maintain turned brittle and gray before everyone's eyes. Meanwhile, in Dusty Creek, something miraculous was happening. Across the entire community, residents began experiencing full water pressure for the first time in years. Faucets roared. Showers flowed strong. Hoses could finally reach the edges of gardens without sputtering. People noticed. They whispered about it. Some even commented out loud, "It's like the water just came back." And Diane heard them. Oh, she heard every word. Panic set in. Diesel, who'd somehow received an invitation despite their long feud, told me later that Diane looked like a woman possessed. She stormed across her property, screaming at her staff, yelling into walkie-talkies, slapping papers out of people's hands. She accused her maintenance team of sabotage, blamed the caterers, accused the water district of revenge. But none of her accusations stuck. Because no one could find the problem. There was no problem to find. Her system was running exactly as it had been designed, just not by her. And the more she tried to compensate, to increase output, to crank the pumps, the faster she drained herself dry. By sunset, her party had devolved into chaos. Guests fled. Some out of discomfort. Others, quietly thrilled to witness the fall of a tyrant. The country band packed up early. The caterers left dishes unwashed. And Diane? Diane stood in the middle of her dead lawn, dress soaked in sweat, mascara running, eyes wide with confusion and fury as she stared at the wreckage of her empire. I stayed until dark. Until the last light in her ranch house flickered off. Until her pastures faded into dust and silence. And I knew, without question, that somewhere beyond this world, my wife was watching. Smiling. Because justice, when it finally came, wasn't loud. It didn't need applause. It just needed water. Flowing strong again in the right direction. The woman who had stolen everyone's water to build her empire was finally learning what real thirst felt like. 4 years, Diane Harper had siphoned water away from the community, not just for survival, but for the decadence of ornamental fountains, manicured fields, and an image of prosperity that came at the expense of her neighbors. But now, as her once flawless operation crumbled from within, it was poetic justice that did the dismantling. Her water empire, constructed with cunning theft and concealed engineering, was consuming itself with the mechanical inevitability of good design applied to a moral cause. But the best part? This was only the beginning of her downfall. What came next would prove that some mistakes don't just result in setbacks, they spawn consequences that ripple outward forever. If this sent a chill down your spine, comment karma, because what unfolded next was the kind of justice that doesn't fade with time. The kind that leaves permanent scars. The morning after her failed spectacle of a party, I assumed Diane would try to recover with speed and precision. She had the money and influence to bring in elite repair crews, water trucks from private suppliers, even seasoned engineers who might piece together what had gone wrong. After all, she'd built her entire ranching empire on precision, intimidation, and control. But instead of responding with technical savvy, she defaulted to the same bullying tactics that had kept the community under her thumb for years. Rather than acknowledge the mechanical failure that was methodically draining her property, she framed it as sabotage. She didn't understand the depth of the engineering trap I had set, so she assumed it must be an attack, and she demanded answers. She scheduled a mandatory emergency meeting at the community hall, summoning every property owner in Dusty Creek under threat of escalating fines for non-attendance. The message was clear: she would regain control through intimidation, the same way she always had. But this time, something shifted. When the evening of the emergency meeting arrived, something unprecedented happened. People simply didn't come. 4 years, the residents of Dusty Creek had tolerated Diane's rule, bending to her power because they felt they had no choice. But now? They were experiencing strong, steady water pressure in their homes. Their bills were finally reflecting only their personal usage, rather than subsidizing Diane's sprawling operation. Their gardens were alive. Their lawns were green. Their faucets no longer gurgled air and rust. The transformation was as visible as it was miraculous, and residents weren't about to give it up for the sake of Diane's manufactured crisis. They understood, perhaps for the first time, the exact scale of what had been taken from them all these years. They recognized the lie. And they were done being complicit in their own exploitation. Of the few who did attend the meeting, none arrived to apologize or confess. They came with questions, pointed, direct, unflinching. Questions like, why had their water suddenly improved? Why had no one been able to inspect the community system for years? Why had reports gone unanswered? Diane, flustered and furious, tried to regain control. But before she could deliver her carefully rehearsed threats, something happened that neither she nor anyone else expected. State investigators arrived. Representatives from the Texas Water Development Board, armed with legal authority and forensic tools, stepped into the meeting with clipboards and badges. Someone had filed formal complaints, detailed, accurate, and supported by evidence. The allegations included unauthorized water usage, fraudulent permits, and deliberate misdirection of public utilities. The state took those complaints very seriously. Within hours, the investigators had made their way to Diane's ranch. With ground-penetrating radar, pipe tracing equipment, and legal warrants in hand, they uncovered the hidden network Diane had used to bleed the community dry for over 5 years. Unauthorized taps. Pumps installed without permits. Pipelines deliberately routed to bypass regulation. They discovered infrastructure that had never been registered, pumps drawing from municipal sources without meters, and entire documentation trails falsified to mislead inspectors. Worst of all, they found evidence of collusion: county officials who had received improper payments, inspectors who had overlooked glaring violations, and paperwork that had been doctored to support fraudulent acquisitions. The financial damage was staggering. When the investigators compiled utility records, they discovered that Diane had stolen over $500,000 worth of water. That water wasn't just used for survival or subsistence, it was used to inflate the value of her cattle ranch, to power industrial-scale irrigation, and to maintain cosmetic landscaping designed to signal wealth and power. But more than that, she had charged the costs of that stolen water back to the community. She made her victims pay for their own exploitation through artificially high utility bills. Diane hadn't just been a thief, she'd been running an illegal utility monopoly under the disguise of HOA leadership. The investigators uncovered it all. And while the legal consequences were significant, charges of systematic fraud, conspiracy, unauthorized resource extraction, and corruption involving public officials, it was the engineering that truly sealed Diane's fate. The system I had reversed, customized, and reprogrammed was doing exactly what I intended, turning her own infrastructure against her. Every adjustment she made, every repair she attempted, only worsened the crisis. The pumps she replaced worked perfectly, but they pushed water out instead of pulling it in. The new pipes she installed were routed directly into drainage fields. The irrigation system, designed to maximize absorption, had been reprogrammed to create overflow. She tried everything. Nothing worked. Contractors came and went, scratching their heads and cashing their checks. Consulting engineers brought in from Dallas were baffled. Their reports showed no faults in the components, but a total system collapse at the macro level. Nothing Diane could do made sense of the failure, and each fix drained more money and hope from her crumbling empire. By the end of 2 weeks, Harper Ranch was unrecognizable. The lush green showcase property had turned to dust. Brown grass crunched underfoot. Trees wilted under the July sun. Once healthy cattle, deprived of consistent hydration, showed visible signs of stress and dehydration. Their value plummeted, and Diane was forced to sell at emergency prices to ranchers who still had water. The same fountains that once welcomed guests now sat dry and cracking under algae scum. Her irrigation systems, once the envy of every landowner in 3 counties, became monuments to her hubris, idle, sun-bleached relics of a scheme that had finally consumed itself. Meanwhile, Dusty Creek flourished. Families who had struggled for years saw their monthly expenses stabilize. Kids could play in the sprinklers again. Lawns and gardens bloomed. Elderly residents no longer had to ration water. Property values rose as buyers took interest in a community that had reclaimed itself. More importantly, something intangible changed. A sense of unity, of pride, of justice. People began to talk again, neighbors reconnected, and former victims of Diane's manipulation stepped forward with stories and evidence. Diesel, who'd been one of the first to suffer under her regime, was able to afford legal representation. Lawsuits were filed. Some sought damages. Others demanded restitution. But all of them demanded accountability. For the first time in over 5 years, Dusty Creek wasn't Diane Harper's kingdom. It was a community. And it had reclaimed its soul. Then came the indictments. The state filed multiple charges. Water code violations. Systematic fraud. Tampering with public utilities. Improper influence of elected officials. Her assets were frozen, her associates questioned, and the ranch itself was seized as part of a broader restitution package for her victims. Some of her closest allies turned against her, cutting deals in exchange for reduced sentences. Diane Harper stood alone. Her empire gone. Her freedom in jeopardy. Her legacy reduced to court transcripts and dried-up pastureland. And me? I returned to the land where my home once stood, where my wife's memorial garden had been ripped apart by Diane's men 3 years earlier. I dug new rows. I tilled clean, untainted soil. I laid irrigation pipes that drew honest water. And I planted sunflowers. 18 months later, I stand in a field of light. Thousands of sunflowers, golden and tall, turned their faces to the morning sun. The same sun my wife used to talk about during her last days, imagining these very blossoms rising from dust and grief. Across the valley, Harper Ranch is a ruin. A cracked monument to greed. To theft. To tyranny undone by its own overreach. And here, on the opposite ridge, my garden blooms. Not as revenge. But as remembrance. As resilience. The woman who tried to erase my wife's memory learned that some things, love, justice, truth, can't be stolen. They can only be honored. One seed at a time. Type forever, if you want to see how this story finally ends. Because the conclusion? It will stay with you longer than any courtroom verdict ever could. On the opposite side of the valley, where Diane Harper once ruled over a vast 200-acre empire built on intimidation, exploitation, and theft, now lies a barren expanse, a true wasteland. It is a scorched landscape stripped of its former opulence and vitality, and it stands as a permanent, unflinching monument to what happens when one woman's unchecked ambition and greed try to steal the irreplaceable. Nature has reclaimed her ranch not with beauty or abundance, but with desolation, as if the earth itself had passed judgment. Following Diane's conviction, the state seized her property as part of the legal proceedings. But any plans to repurpose or sell it for development were immediately thwarted by the devastation my water reversal system had unleashed. The damage was not cosmetic, it was infrastructural, elemental. Restoration would have required more capital than the land was worth, turning any effort at rehabilitation into economic absurdity. Diane's dream had turned into a cautionary tale. Her own greed had made rebuilding impossible. But from that impossibility came something inspired. Rather than allow the land to rot in vain, the state made a decision that was, in its own way, poetic justice. They converted Diane Harper's ranch into an environmental education center. It now serves as a living classroom, a living scar on the landscape where school children and visitors come to learn about the importance of water conservation, environmental ethics, and the irreversible damage exploitation can cause. They walk the cracked soil and sun-scorched pastures, and they don't just hear about the consequences of corruption, they see them. Diane herself received a 5-year sentence for a litany of crimes: unlawful water diversion, systematic fraud, conspiracy to commit regulatory violations, and corrupt influence over public officials. At sentencing, the judge was uncompromising. He labeled her behavior a gross abuse of trust, a violation of the public good, and a personal betrayal of the very community she claimed to serve. He described her actions as a deliberate, calculated campaign to exploit the powerless while enriching herself. And, notably, she showed not 1 ounce of remorse. The restitution process was just as significant. Diane was ordered to pay $300,000 to the victims she had defrauded, as a starting point to help them rebuild lives she had so deeply damaged. Others who participated in her illegal operation, county officials who had falsified inspection reports, engineers who installed illegal pipeline connections, and contractors who turned a blind eye, faced justice as well. Some received shorter sentences but were permanently barred from ever holding public office or working in water management again. The entire network that enabled Diane's tyranny was dismantled. The aftermath transformed Dusty Creek in ways no one could have predicted. What had once been a town suffocating under Diane's grip bloomed into something new, something hopeful. Property values rose by over 40%, a dramatic signal that confidence and optimism had returned. Water bills, once bloated to subsidize Diane's theft, dropped to fair and manageable levels. New businesses opened. A bakery, a co-op market, even a small bookstore, ventures that couldn't have survived under Diane's rule began to thrive. Families who had been priced out or bullied away returned. Young couples bought the homes left behind by Diane's victims, filling them with laughter, resilience, and new dreams. The culture of fear that had dominated the town was replaced by open discussion, town hall meetings, and collective decision-making. Real democracy took root. And in this rebirth, a surprising leader emerged: Diesel. Once a broken rancher who'd lost everything, Diesel used his settlement to start a water management consulting firm. Drawing from his own painful experience, he now travels the state helping other communities detect and dismantle similar illegal extraction systems. He's testified before the state legislature and helped uncover exploitation rings in 3 other counties. He turned his loss into purpose, his anger into momentum. She took everything from me, he told a reporter recently, but in doing so, she gave me something bigger, a reason to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Diesel has become my closest ally and dearest friend. He understands loss on a level most can't. And like me, he understands the quiet satisfaction of seeing justice not only delivered but grown, like roots beneath the surface. The Environmental Education Center on Diane's old ranch has become a place of pilgrimage for people seeking answers, healing, and understanding. School groups come regularly to explore the site. They're led along walking tours that pass sun-scorched tree husks, cracked fountain beds, and rusting pipes, once the veins of Diane's stolen empire. Side by side with these scars are plaques, murals, and interactive exhibits that tell the story of how corruption blooms, and how it can be uprooted. One particularly moving section is dedicated to the families displaced by Diane's schemes. Their stories are told through photographs, audio recordings, and personal artifacts, children's drawings, saved utility bills, eviction notices. They are no longer statistics, they are survivors, honored and remembered. The section that means the most to me, however, is the one dedicated to my wife. There, amid gentle music and golden imagery, is a small but powerful display that tells her story, how a dying woman's final wish for a sunflower garden became the spark that ignited a revolution against injustice. How her memory became more than just a personal grief, but a guiding light for a movement. My garden, my promise to her, now thrives. Those sunflowers stretch across 5 full acres of vibrant gold, turning each morning toward the rising sun as she always said they would. I tend them every day, not because I must, but because I want to. And each season, I harvest seeds from the strongest blooms and give them away. Hundreds of families across the state have now planted their own sunflower memorials. Veterans, widows, cancer survivors, and children who lost parents, each patch is a tribute to resilience, love, and the quiet revolution of memory. Cancer support groups use our sunflowers as symbols of hope. Veterans plant them in therapeutic gardens to help manage trauma. Schools use them in science classes to teach about sustainability and renewal. And in every petal, my wife's legacy endures. The irony is striking. Diane Harper tried to erase my wife's memory by destroying our land. She tried to leave me with nothing but bitterness and dust. But in the end, it was her legacy that was reduced to dust, and my wife's that now grows with every sunrise. Diane's name is now barely whispered, associated only with failure and disgrace. But my wife's name is spoken across communities, tied to healing, justice, and beauty. Her story, and the garden that blossomed from it, have outlived every scheme Diane ever conceived. Some say you can't fight City Hall. But sometimes City Hall isn't a government, it's a woman with a clipboard and no conscience. And sometimes all it takes to defeat her is one person who refuses to be afraid anymore. One person who's willing to fight for love, for justice, and for the memories of those who gave us everything. And sometimes, justice doesn't come in a courtroom or a jail cell. It comes in the form of golden petals, blooming eternally in a field that was once a battleground. It comes in the laughter of children playing in honest soil. It comes in the peace found among wildflowers that grew from the ashes of grief. This is our story. One of many. But if you've ever been wronged, if someone has ever tried to steal your light, your love, your dreams, then let this be your reminder, you are not powerless. Justice is not a myth. And sometimes, when all else fails, love blooms anyway. We're QA Stories. And if this tale moved you, wait until you hear the next one. The end. You can't just go around digging holes like some outlaw, she sneered, seconds before slapping me with a formal violation for using a shovel, on my own damn land. I'd bought these 50 acres with what was left of my life savings, intending nothing more than to plant sunflowers in memory of my late wife. That was it. No business scheme. No development plan. Just a man trying to keep a promise. But apparently in Texas Hill Country, even something as innocent as planting flowers becomes a federal offense when Queen Diane Harper says so. She called it unauthorized water access. Said my simple irrigation setup violated some obscure clause in a covenant I never signed. Then she sent her goons, under the Dusty Creek Homeowners Association banner, to rip out my sprinkler lines as if I were running a casino or cooking meth. They didn't even knock. Just tore through my rows like a tornado of boots, metal, and destruction. You ever have someone stomp on your grief, not because they had to, but because they wanted to? Just to prove they could? Stick around. Because people like her always think they're untouchable, until they're not. Let me rewind a bit. After my wife passed away from ovarian cancer, I couldn't stay in California anymore. Every room in that house felt like a haunted museum. Her scent still lingered on the pillow. Her coffee mug stayed untouched in the cabinet. The kitchen echoed with memories of her humming while baking, each one a dagger to the heart. When I left, I didn't just move, I escaped. I sold the house, closed my business, and packed everything into a truck. With what little energy I had left, I found a piece of land that reminded me of her, open, golden, and peaceful. 50 acres of rolling hills nestled in a quiet corner of Texas. A place where I could keep the last promise I ever made to her. Make them grow, honey, she whispered in her final hours, eyes half-lidded, fingers tangled in mine. Plant sunflowers somewhere beautiful. So I can find you again. That promise was all I had left. So I chose land with good soil and natural drainage. Perfect for a small well, nothing industrial, just enough to keep a memorial garden alive under the brutal Texas sun. Then she arrived. Diane Harper made her first appearance on my third morning, striding onto my land with the swagger of a sheriff in an old western. I was kneeling by a section of PVC tubing, gently adjusting the water flow to my seedlings when I heard a voice behind me. Well, hello there, California boy, she sang out with syrupy condescension. She was in her early 50s, dressed like a church-going senator's wife, heels crunching on gravel, crimson lipstick too sharp against her tan skin. Her smile was all edges, like a blade wrapped in silk. Her eyes, though, her eyes were worse. Cold. Calculating. Like she was scanning my soul for leverage. I stood and introduced myself. Told her I was new to the area. Explained that I'd lost my wife, and that I was planting flowers in her honor. I even smiled, thinking maybe she was just curious. Maybe she'd welcome me. Instead, I watched something twisted flicker across her face. A kind of hungry delight. Oh honey, she said, voice thick with fake pity. You look so sad. What are you planning with all this gardening? The way she said it, she made gardening sound like arson. I made the mistake of being honest. Told her about the cancer. The hospital. The promise. I explained the well, small, practical, unobtrusive. Just enough to water a patch of sunflowers. Her reaction? She laughed. Flowers won't bring her back, sweetheart. Her laughter sounded like glass breaking inside a church. And we have community water sharing rules here in Dusty Creek. Can't have everyone digging wells willy-nilly. Might disrupt our system. What system? I asked, genuinely confused. What community rules? This is my land. That's when the mask dropped. Welcome to reality, sweetheart, she said, voice low now. This is my neighborhood. We do things my way. You'll learn. I went inside that night and tore through my land purchase documents like a madman. Purchase contract. Inspection report. Title transfer. All of it looked clean, until I hit subsection 12 on page 17 of the closing disclosure. Buried in fine print, property use subject to homeowners association water management protocols. That clause hadn't been there when I signed. I'd bet my soul on it. It had been added, probably slipped in during final recording after the ink dried. I called my realtor. No answer. Left 4 voicemails. I contacted the title company. They claimed no knowledge of HOA involvement. It was like I'd bought into a ghost town governed by shadows. The next morning, a white pickup truck pulled into my driveway. A man in mirrored sunglasses stepped out and handed me an envelope. Never made eye contact. Dusty Creek Homeowners Association violation notice. Formal language. Legal threats. Unauthorized agricultural activity detected on Lot 47. Cease all cultivation immediately. Violation of community water protocol. Daily fines of $200 will accrue until compliance is achieved. $200 per day. 4 growing flowers. I read it 3 times. My hands were trembling so bad I almost dropped the paper. Then I stepped outside, heart racing. Half of my seedlings, my wife's sunflowers, were already wilting. The sprinklers had been hacked to pieces. Heads crushed. Lines cut. I stood there in the dirt. Grief and fury collided in my chest. For the first time since her funeral, I felt something. Not sadness. Not depression. Rage. Diane Harper thought she was bullying some grieving widower too broken to fight back. What she didn't know was that I'd spent 15 years as a systems engineer, specializing in irrigation and water flow. I'd designed water recovery systems for desert farms. I understood how water moves, how to redirect it, how to hide it. And more importantly, She had no clue I had nothing left to lose. But what she did next pushed me past the point of no return. Each time I replanted, her goons came back. Not like clockwork, no, theatrically. As if they were staging a show for her personal amusement. They'd arrive within a day, dismantling each tiny plant with surgical cruelty. They scattered seeds. Bent stems. Damaged hoses just enough to drain water without me noticing at first. And Diane would watch. From her porch. Sipping sweet tea like some southern queen watching a public execution. This wasn't about rules. It wasn't about water conservation. This was about control. Pain. Power. She was an emotional vampire, feeding on my sorrow with every destroyed petal, every crushed shoot. After the fourth time they tore up my garden, I stood at the edge of my property, shaking with helpless fury. That's when a battered Ford pickup rattled into my driveway. The man who stepped out was older, with hands that told stories. His eyes carried the weight of buried pain. "You the sunflower guy?" he asked, no introduction, no pretense. I nodded. "She got to you, too," he said, almost kindly. Then he spit into the dust. His name was Diesel Murphy. Owned the property just down the road. Said his family had worked the land for generations, small ranch, some corn, a few cattle. Nothing fancy. Then Diane Harper decided I was using too much water, he muttered. Next thing I know, they're fining me, shutting off my supply, claiming I'm stealing from the community pool, even though there ain't no damn pool. He lost half his herd before he could drill a legal well. Ended up selling his stock. Now he worked at an auto repair shop just to